For 12 years, our nation was afflicted with hear nothing, see nothing, do nothing government. The nation looked to that government, but that government looked away. And my friends, powerful influences strive today to restore that kind of government with its doctrine that that government is best which is most indifferent to mankind. We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob.
In 1932, one of the most historic events in American history took place. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected as the 32nd President of the United States in a landslide victory against Republican President Herbert Hoover. The ascendancy of FDR and his New Deal program during the Great Depression radically shifted what Americans had come to expect from their government and saw a massive expansion of government influence in the economy through public programs, regulations, and higher taxes. During World War II, FDR was quoted as saying, "In this time of grave national danger, when all excess income should go to the war, no American citizen ought to have a net income after he has paid his taxes of more than $25,000. For context, that's about $400,000 in today's money." While FDR's policies were called socialism by his detractors, they were inarguably popular and helped ordinary Americans, and allowed him to coast to re-election 3 times, being the only president in American history to serve more than 2 terms in office. His policies were so popular that they forced the Republican Party to adopt many of them in order to win elections. Throughout Republican President Eisenhower's presidency, the top marginal income tax rate was 91%. For context, the top marginal income tax rate is only 39.6% today. Eisenhower was quoted as saying, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes that you can do these things. Among them are a few Texas oil millionaires and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid." Well, Eisenhower was certainly correct about them being stupid, but they weren't quite as few in number as he thought. In 1964, that radical contingent of the Republican Party managed to get Barry Goldwater over the finish line to clinch the Republican nomination for president. Unlike Eisenhower, Barry Goldwater was anything but a moderate. He was a hardline conservative who advocated cutting taxes and slashing government programs. Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, meanwhile, ran on a platform of significantly expanding the federal government in the form of his Great Society programs and his passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Goldwater opposed both, claiming they were a slippery slope on the way to socialism and erasing states' rights. Lyndon Johnson ended up winning the election with the largest share of the popular vote for any Democrat in all of American history, with 61.1% of the electorate. It was a stunning repudiation of right-wing extremism, and LBJ used the mandate given to him and the massive Democratic majorities in the House and Senate to pass the Medicare and Medicaid programs, extending health insurance coverage to millions of elderly and poor Americans. Of course, the success wouldn't last, however. In 1968, Republican Richard Nixon won the popular vote by less than 1% against Democrat Hubert Humphrey. Nixon then went on to win the largest share of the popular vote for any Republican in all of American history against Democrat George McGovern with 60.7% of the electorate. The election certainly wasn't a thorough repudiation of liberalism, though, as some have claimed. Nixon was no Barry Goldwater and had kept in place essentially all of LBJ's Great Society programs. The top marginal income tax rate under Nixon was 70%, and Nixon actually increased the top capital gains tax rate from what it had been under Johnson. His administration created the Environmental Protection Agency, passed the Clean Air Act of 1970, and introduced price controls to deal with inflation. By most accounts, Richard Nixon was a New Deal Republican, earning him his reputation as the last liberal Republican America has ever had. But then, of course, soon after winning re-election, you had the Watergate scandal, impeachment, Nixon resigning, Vice President Gerald Ford took over.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
And in 1976, Democrat Jimmy Carter ended up defeating Ford by about 2% in the popular vote. But in the 1976 Republican primary, Gerald Ford ended up facing an insurgent primary challenge from the Republican Party's conservative wing. That primary challenger would end up winning the 1980 Republican nomination and run against Jimmy Carter in the general.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Ronald Reagan was the most right-wing president the United States had seen since Herbert Hoover, possibly more right-wing than Herbert Hoover, actually. He proudly boasted the slogan, "The best government is that which governs least." Much like Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan ran on a platform of slashing taxes, slashing spending, slashing regulation, and states' rights. He ended up winning the 1980 election against Jimmy Carter by nearly 10% in the popular vote. So what changed? Why was Barry Goldwater so unelectable in 1964, but Ronald Reagan, who had a very similar platform to Goldwater, and had in fact campaigned for Goldwater in 1964, won by such a comfortable margin 16 years later? Well, the year 1980 was certainly a turbulent time for America. Abroad, the Iran hostage crisis had made America and President Carter look weak and impotent. The domestic economy was also stagnating, while at the same time inflation had reached its highest level in decades. People were dissatisfied with the status quo, and as the 2016 election showed, when voters are dissatisfied with the status quo, they'll revolt against it, no matter how extreme the alternative is. However, by the time Ronald Reagan ran for re-election in 1984 against Walter Mondale, inflation had dropped and the economy was in full recovery, sporting a near unprecedented 7.2% GDP growth in that fiscal year. Ronald Reagan won the election in a landslide with 58.8% of the popular vote, although he only got 9% of the black vote. Gee, I wonder why.
Those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Although it wasn't quite as crushing a popular vote victory as Johnson had won in 1964 and Nixon had won in 1972, no other president has come close to winning by such large margins since 1984, and thus it was the fulfillment of a true political realignment in the USA, where America, or at least white America, had lurched to the right. The conservative base of the Republican Party had become the party establishment, and since then, most Republican candidates talk about how they want to bring the USA back to the glory days of Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump consistently tried to tie his 2016 presidential run to Ronald Reagan. When he said, "Make America Great Again," the mythical pastime he was referring to where America used to be great was in the 1980s, where Ronald Reagan was president. Not only that, but the slogan, "Make America Great Again," wasn't invented by Trump. He copied it from Ronald Reagan, who used the same slogan in his 1980 campaign. 44 years after Ronald Reagan was elected, the Republican Party still holds Reaganomics, or more technically supply-side economics, as its fundamental belief, an economic philosophy that is complete and total bullcrap. Reaganomics does not work, and never has. But you might be asking yourself, well, if Reaganomics doesn't work, then how did Ronald Reagan win in such a landslide victory in 1984? Clearly the white American electorate thought it was working. Well, yes, but they were wrong. As a matter of fact, an ABC News poll in September 1986 showed that 63% of Americans didn't know enough about the Tax Reform Act of 1986 to say whether or not it was good or bad. So let's go back to the 1980s and establish what actually happened. Although Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter by a wide margin when he was inaugurated as president, the Democrats still controlled the House of Representatives. Despite that, Ronald Reagan's silver tongue and his sky-high approval rating after a failed assassination attempt allowed him to convince the Democratic House to pass a tax cut bill during his first year in office. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 reduced the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50%, reduced the bottom marginal income tax rate from 14% to 11%, cut the top capital gains tax rate from 28% to 20%, and reduced the amount of people liable to the estate tax. The bill was marketed as a way to revitalize the American economy and spur economic growth. Of course, many politicians at the time worried that the tax cuts would blow a hole in the budget and increase the national deficit. But Reagan's sycophants said there was nothing to worry about and that the economy would grow so fast that the tax cuts would pay for themselves. Did that happen? Well, no, of course not. It's a simple math issue. When you increase government spending, you increase the debt. When you cut taxes, you increase the debt. When you cut spending, you decrease the debt. When you raise taxes, you decrease the debt. The supply-side economics claim that tax cuts pay for themselves is ludicrous. It's magical thinking. That's why George H.W. Bush called the idea voodoo economics during the 1980 Republican primary. The idea was primarily popularized by an economist named Arthur Laffer, who worked as an economic advisor to Ronald Reagan and then later Donald Trump. Laffer was famous for the Laffer curve, a theoretical mathematical relationship between tax revenues and tax rates. It holds that there is a specific tax rate where tax revenue can be maximized. If taxes are too low, then the government revenue drops. But if taxes are too high, then government revenue can also drop because higher income people won't be as economically productive. Republicans, including Laffer himself, seem to have ignored the part of the Laffer curve theory where tax rates can also potentially be too low. But regardless, the important part is that Laffer was wrong about the optimal top marginal tax rate, even back in the 1970s. Studies trying to estimate the optimal top marginal tax rate for maximizing revenue vary and are affected by loopholes, deductions, and tax avoidance. But the theorized optimal top tax rate hovers around 70%, which, as it happens, was the exact top marginal tax rate before Reagan got into office. We were literally already at the theorized optimal top rate before Reagan came along. The Office of Tax Analysis estimated that the 1981 tax cut bill reduced federal revenues by around 13% compared to what they would have been had the bill never been passed. And most of Ronald Reagan's officials knew at the time that the tax cut would not pay for itself and were counting on spending cuts to avoid blowing up the deficit. The problem was that despite Ronald Reagan running on balancing the budget and talking about how all of the out-of-control government spending was bankrupting the country, at the same time, Ronald Reagan also ran on massively increasing the military budget. In reality, Ronald Reagan did not cut government spending, he increased government spending. As a matter of fact, government spending has increased during every Republican administration since Ronald Reagan. Republicans do not care about cutting spending, they only care about cutting spending that helps poor people. There's a reason why during World War I and World War II taxes were hiked, because having a powerful military is really expensive, and you have to find a way to pay for it. And something that has been largely forgotten is that the Reagan administration actually signed into law 4 separate bills in 1982, 1983, 1984, and 1987, which didn't increase the income tax, but did do things like increasing payroll taxes and excise taxes to claw back enough revenue in order to fund the government. During his second term, Ronald Reagan ended up signing another tax cut into law. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 reduced the corporate tax rate from 46% to 34% and reduced the top marginal income tax rate from 50% all the way down to a historic low of 28%. But at the same time, the 1986 tax cut bill also raised the bottom marginal tax rate from 11% to 15%. This was the first time in U.S. history that the top tax rate was lowered at the same time as the bottom tax rate was raised. Ronald Reagan literally raised taxes on the poor in order to give tax breaks to the rich, like an evil cartoon villain. The 1986 tax cut bill also raised the top capital gains tax rate from 20% back up to what it had been before, 28%. But even with these offsetting attempts to try to increase revenue, it still wasn't enough. So-called deficit hawks in Congress made a big stink about the fact that the national debt nearly doubled under Obama, but the national debt nearly tripled under Ronald Reagan. In 1981, the first year of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the national debt was 31% of GDP. By 1989, at the end of his presidency, the national debt was 51% of GDP. When Vice President George W. Bush was nominated in 1988, he made his famous pledge,
"And the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips, no new taxes."
Of course, he went back on his pledge and signed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1990 to increase the top marginal rate from 28% to 31%, and raise excise taxes and Medicare payroll taxes in order to deal with the ever-ballooning national debt. It still wasn't enough, though, because by the end of George H.W. Bush's presidency in 1993, the national debt had grown to 63% of GDP. Then, later in that year, the new President Bill Clinton passed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1993, which raised the corporate tax rate from 34% to 35% and raised the top marginal income tax rate from 31% to 39.6% and scrapped the Medicare cap completely. Even with Bill Clinton lowering the top capital gains tax rate from 28% to 20% in 1997, the 1993 tax hike, coupled with Bill Clinton actually cutting military spending, meant that by the end of his presidency in 2001, the national debt was down to 55% of GDP. Bill Clinton was the last president in American history who actually decreased the debt to GDP ratio. But then George W. Bush came along and decided that the best thing to do with the budget surplus Bill Clinton had left him with was to get rid of it. He signed the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001 and the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003, which both lowered the bottom marginal income tax rate from 15% to 10%, lowered the top marginal income tax rate from 39.6% to 35%, lowered the top capital gains tax rate from 20% to 15%, and he set estate taxes to be eliminated completely. Unlike Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, he never made any tax increases to make up for the lost revenue, and he got America involved in 2 wars and 2 costly foreign occupations, which he forgot to pay for. And oh yeah, he sent the economy careening into the greatest recession since 1946 on his way out. By 2009, at the end of his presidency, the national debt was 82% of GDP. Thanks a lot, Bush. The national debt did grow to around 104% of GDP by the end of Obama's presidency in 2017, but the national deficit actually decreased every year under Obama except for his last year in office. Donald Trump ended up passing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which reduced the top marginal income tax rate from 39.6% to 37%, reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, and reduced the amount of people liable for estate taxes. The national deficit increased every year Trump was in office, with the national debt growing to 124% of GDP after only 4 years of his presidency by 2021. Not one Republican president since Richard Nixon can actually claim to have reduced government debt as a percentage of GDP. And this is important because Republicans like former House Speaker Paul Ryan portrayed themselves as responsible fiscal conservatives who were deeply concerned with the future of America's financial solvency. But it was all a sham. Paul Ryan never cared about fiscal responsibility. He was never a deficit hawk. If he had been, he wouldn't have voted for George W. Bush's tax cuts or Donald Trump's tax cuts, which combined are estimated to have added about $10 trillion to the national debt by 2023. Okay, sure, I hear what you're saying. Maybe the tax cuts didn't pay for themselves. Maybe they were somewhat irresponsible. But they still did end up increasing economic growth, right? I mean, of course they did, right? Well, let's see about that. After the 1981 tax cut bill was passed, the economy immediately fell off a cliff the next year, with the country suffering the worst economic recession since 1946. So, no, it appears that the 1981 tax cut bill did not have its intended effect of increasing economic growth. Am I saying that the tax cuts caused the recession? Of course not. But it's also foolish to claim that the tax cuts caused the historic economic growth seen 3 years later in 1984. I wonder if there was something other than tax rates that could better explain the economic trends during that time. Well, there was. Interest rates. In 1981, the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates to an unprecedented high of nearly 20%. This was done to deal with that pesky inflation problem I mentioned earlier. Most economists agree that raising federal interest rates can help lower inflation. When interest rates rise, consumers are incentivized to spend less and save more of their money. This lowers demand for goods, which can bring down prices. However, because of this, raising interest rates can also have the unfortunate side effect of slowing economic growth and increasing unemployment. It's not surprising that when federal interest rates were hiked to nearly 20% in 1981, there was a major economic recession in 1982, which saw mass unemployment. However, in 1983, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates in half as inflation had finally come down from a high of nearly 15% to under 5%. Because of this, the economy recovered, and by 1984 had seen one of its best years ever. It was slashing interest rates that spurred economic growth, not tax cuts. Well, you might be saying, sure, maybe cutting interest rates had something to do with the economic recovery, but are you really saying that the tax cuts didn't affect economic growth at all? No, I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that the economy is influenced by a variety of factors, and tax rates affect the economy a lot less than people think. Other factors arguably have a much bigger effect on the economy, like global oil prices, for instance. The oil price shocks of the 1970s were the main causes of the stagflation during that time period, and many economists agree that the economy likely would have naturally recovered on its own had Reagan's tax cut bill never been passed. See, here's the thing. Supply-side economists claim over and over and over again that tax cuts spur economic growth. So if that's true, we might expect to see some actual evidence for it. We would expect to see some sort of a correlation between lower taxes and higher economic growth. But that's not what the data shows. This right here is a graph charting yearly GDP growth by the top marginal income tax rate every year between 1948 and 2020. Can you see a correlation between a low marginal income tax rate and high economic growth? Because I can't. This dot circled right up here was 1984, the 7.2 annual GDP growth under Ronald Reagan I mentioned before. These two dots circled up here were 1950 and 1951, where under Democratic President Harry Truman, the top marginal income tax rate was much higher, and GDP growth was also higher than it was in 1984. You can also see that when top marginal tax rates were lower than 60%, 1984 was the only year where annual GDP growth went above 6%. However, when the top marginal tax rate was higher than 60%, there were 7 years where annual GDP growth was above 6%. These three dots circled down here were the biggest economic recessions that happened during this time period, in 1982, 2009, and 2020. As you can see, all of them took place when the top marginal income tax rates were on the lower side. Like I said before, there is no correlation whatsoever between lower taxes and higher economic growth. The year 1984 was a fluke. And actually, let's talk about 1984 some more. Ronald Reagan's 1981 tax cut bill had lowered the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50%. But 50% is still more than 10% higher than it was under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. It was only in Ronald Reagan's second term that the top marginal income tax rate was driven down to a historic low of 28% after Reagan's 1986 tax cut bill. And if lowering the top marginal tax rate to 50% created a yearly GDP growth of 7.2%, lowering it all the way down to 28% must have prompted even larger GDP growth, right? Well, look at the circled dots and you tell me. But you might say, well, income taxes aren't the only kind of taxes, so you're missing the big picture here. Okay, let's look at the big picture. Throughout Ronald Reagan's presidency, the corporate tax rate was 46%, until his 1986 tax cut bill lowered it to 34%. Today, the corporate tax rate is just 21%. Throughout all of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the estate tax rate was 55%. Today, the estate tax rate is 40%. After the 1986 tax cut bill, the top capital gains tax rate was raised from 20% to 28%. Today, the top capital gains tax rate is back down to 20%. The irony is that modern-day Republicans claim we have to return to the glory days of Reagan by cutting taxes as low can go, but for the most part, taxes were higher under Ronald Reagan than any president since Ronald Reagan. And yet, we hear the same tired arguments over and over and over again. In 1993, President Bill Clinton planned to pass a bill increasing the top marginal income tax rate from 31% to 39.6%. Republicans in Congress were screaming bloody murder. They said, "How dare you? This is a horrible idea. This is going to kill the economy. It's going to send us right back into recession." And then none of that happened. Bill Clinton oversaw a booming economy throughout his administration. In fact, the economy under Bill Clinton grew more quickly than it did under his replacement, George W. Bush, who cut income taxes, capital gains taxes, and phased out the estate tax entirely by 2010. Then, President Obama decided that he was going to let George Bush's tax cuts expire. Not all of them. Obama was only planning on letting the top marginal income tax rate go up from 35% back to 39.6%, and the top capital gains rate go up from 15% back up to 20%, which is what they were under Bill Clinton, and only having the estate tax rate hiked up to 40% rather than 55%, which is what it had been under Clinton. Republicans in Congress lost their minds. They called Obama a communist, a Marxist. They said, "How dare you? This is a horrible idea. This is going to kill the economy. It's going to send us right back into recession." And then none of that happened. The economy continued to grow fairly consistently throughout Obama's second term. We can also look at the states for yet more evidence. The data gathered over the last 4 decades empirically shows that interstate differences in tax burdens have little, if any, effect on relative rates of economic growth. No matter how many times state politicians, including some Democrats, by the way, claim that cutting taxes will create more jobs in their state, that doesn't make it true. In fact, we can look to a recent and specific example of this ridiculous idea going horribly wrong. Let's talk about Kansas. In 2012, Kansas Republican Governor Sam Brownback signed into law the nation's largest state income tax cut since the 1990s for its wealthiest state residents, as well as cutting business taxes. The tax cut bill was cooked up with the help of Arthur Laffer. Hey, you might remember that guy from before. At the time, conservatives across the nation were heralding Sam Brownback as a conservative hero, talking about how other governors should follow his example to guarantee a prosperous future for their states. Governor Brownback said at the time, quote, "Our new pro-growth tax policy will be like a shot of adrenaline into the heart of the Kansas economy." And Kansas ended up bleeding funds. The state's credit rating was downgraded twice, and by the end of Brownback's governorship, Kansas was ranked 46th out of 50 in job growth. Unlike the federal government, nearly all state governments are constitutionally required to maintain a balanced budget. Unlike Republican presidents, Republican governors can't pay for their tax cuts by blowing up the deficit, so they are forced to make often brutal cuts to public services. And Brownback did, particularly to infrastructure and public education. The cuts became so unpopular that the state legislature voted in 2017 bipartisanly 38-0 in the Senate and 123-2 in the House to repeal the 2012 tax cut bill. Governor Brownback vetoed it, but his veto was overridden. Laura Jean Kelly, a Democrat, would win the 2018 gubernatorial election in deep red Kansas. Don't feel too bad for Brownback, though. He was given a cushy job in the Trump administration. Donald really must have valued his good judgment. You see, the reason why tax cuts fail to create economic growth is because supply-side economics is built on a false premise. They claim the key to economic growth is cutting taxes and cutting spending to create jobs. By returning more money to people's pockets, you will stimulate the economy. The problem is that taxing and spending doesn't take money out of people's pockets. It actually recycles money through the economy and back into people's pockets. Let's take, as an example, student loan forgiveness. The Biden administration has forgiven a significant chunk of federal student loan debt, which costs money. In the past, public college tuition used to be much more affordable, adjusted for inflation, but when state governments made tax cuts, the cost of college tuition spiked. And the federal government has used the interest on federal student loans as a source of funding. Student loan debt is essentially a tax by another name. If the federal government increases income taxes, then it can afford to cut taxes on college students by canceling student loans. This returns more money to people's pockets and thus stimulates the economy. Studies show that temporary tax cuts, especially ones targeted at lower and middle class people, can potentially boost the economy, although in the long term the effect is much weaker. Studies show that government spending is arguably a much more effective way to stimulate the economy than tax cuts are. Rich people save a much greater proportion of their money than poor and middle class people do, which means that their money isn't being spent on buying things, which means that there is less demand for products and services, which means there are less jobs. If you tax rich people to a greater degree, you can use government spending to redistribute their money to ordinary consumers, who are the foundation of the U.S. economy. Now, sometimes the government spends tax money in an inefficient manner. For example, the U.S. has over 700 foreign military bases. It costs money to maintain those military bases, and that government spending doesn't boost the U.S. economy because the soldiers living on those bases are using their government paychecks to spend money in foreign countries. In fact, in general, all that government spending on the military that Republicans love so much has been found to create fewer jobs per penny than government spending invested in things like education and infrastructure. But a lot of government spending is very important and worthwhile. Studies show that for every dollar the U.S. government spends on infrastructure, the economy grows by an extra $1.50. The government puts people to work in infrastructure jobs, which means they have money to spend in their local communities. But more than that, in the long term, having high-quality roads, bridges, railroads, airports, schools, water treatment plants, and other physical assets helps the economy function and grow, and boost the productivity of businesses. Oh, and by the way, a similar economic multiplier effect has been found for food stamps and unemployment insurance, too, in case anyone watching thinks welfare programs are just a drain on the state. Government spending on public services isn't a drag on the U.S. economy. It doesn't crowd out private investment like the supply-side idiots claim it does. The exact opposite is true. And if you want well-maintained public services without blowing up the national deficit, you need to pay for it with taxes. It's as simple as that. Another false premise that supply-side economics is based upon is the idea that taxation disincentivizes work, thus hurting the economy. I mean, after all, if the government is taking half your paycheck, then work becomes less valuable and wealthy people will spend more of their time and effort on something else. What they fail to take into account is that higher taxes can also have the opposite effect. People might be incentivized to innovate and work even harder because they have to in order to make the same amount of money they would have if taxes had been lower. And this is, by the way, assuming that CEOs and executives taking home a bigger bonus is a good thing in the first place. All of that money that business owners take for their personal salary is money that isn't being spent paying workers or investing in improving their business. If top marginal tax rates on income and capital gains are high, it can actually incentivize business owners to keep money in their business and use it to invest in improvements and hiring new employees, which would not be subject to income or capital gains taxes, rather than using the windfall profits to enrich themselves, which would mean a lot of that money would be subject to those taxes. Thus, private businesses are actually incentivized to be more economically productive when top marginal tax rates are high. Multiple studies have showcased that high economic inequality is negatively correlated with economic growth. The Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service issued a report in 2012 analyzing the effects of top tax rates from 1945 to 2010. And concluded that reduced top marginal tax rates have no positive effect on economic growth, saving, investment, or productivity growth. Economist Paul Krugman aptly described supply-side economics as, quote, a classic example of a zombie doctrine, a view that should have been killed by evidence long ago, but just keeps shambling along, eating politicians' brains. So if Reaganomics consistently fails over and over and over again to produce its promised results, why do Republicans keep trying it? Simple. That 2012 report found that reduced top marginal tax rates do have the inarguable effect of increasing income inequality. Reaganomics doesn't grow the economy, it doesn't create jobs, it doesn't reduce the deficit, but it does help a certain group of people. Rich people. The donor class, the people who fund their campaigns, the people Republican politicians really represent. There's a reason why billionaire Elon Musk is supporting a pro-Trump super PAC this election cycle to fund his campaign. You know, Elon Musk has claimed he's doing more than anyone else in the world to save the world from climate change, which makes it a bit odd that he's supporting a political candidate who doesn't even believe in climate change, until you realize that entitled rich pricks like Elon Musk will put their own financial interests over the planet's any day.
And what I see all over the place is people who care about looking good while doing evil.
Me too, Elon. I'm looking at one of them right now. There is incredible irony about Republicans fear-mongering about things like student debt forgiveness, claiming it's giving rich kids a handout, even though student debt forgiveness would disproportionately help poor and middle-class people, while at the same time passing tax cut bills that disproportionately benefit the wealthiest Americans. Whether it's Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, or Sam Brownback, their tax cuts were always intentionally crafted as a handout to the wealthy, while giving everyone else a few breadcrumbs as a distraction. A study found that by 2027, 83% of the benefits of Donald Trump's 2017 tax cut bill would be going to the top 1% richest Americans. But who cares, right? A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. The wealthy are the job creators. They're the most productive citizens. If we just give them more and more and more money, eventually all that wealth will trickle down, right? Well, 4 decades later, that hasn't happened. Income inequality has skyrocketed since 1980, wages for the middle and lower class have stagnated, and the top 1% richest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans. The wealth did not trickle down because it was never supposed to. Supply-side economics is a scam. It's rank propaganda from the rich and the powerful to convince ordinary people to vote against their own interests to elect politicians who will make themselves even richer and even more powerful. So my message to anyone planning on voting this election, don't fall for it.
I've been studying the Republican Party for over 12 years at close hand in the capital of the United States. And by this time, I have discovered where the Republicans stand on most of the major issues. Since they won't tell you themselves, I'm going to tell you. They approve the American farmer, but they're willing to help him go broke. They stand four square for the American home, but not for housing. They are strong for labor, but they are stronger for restricting labor's rights. They favor a minimum wage. The smaller the minimum, the better. They endorse educational opportunity for all, but they won't spend money for teachers or for schools. They think modern medical care and hospitals are fine for people who can afford them. They approve of Social Security benefits, so much so that they took them away from almost 1 million people. They favor the admission of displaced persons, but only within shameful racial and religious limitations. They consider electric power a great blessing, but only when the private power companies get their rake off. They condemn cruelly high prices, but fight to the death every effort to bring them down. They think the American standard of living is a fine thing, so long as it doesn't spread to all the people. And they admire the government of the United States so much that they would like to buy it.